Imagine looking in the mirror and not recognizing the monster staring back, a king whose own blood turned against him, twisted his face, shattered his mind, and doomed an entire empire. This isn't a dark fairy tale. This is royal inbreeding, the most terrifying genetic curse in human history. The mirror doesn't lie, even when you desperately wish it would. You stand there, eyes locked, with a reflection that feels like a cruel punishment, your own features warped beyond recognition by centuries of royal bloodlines interbreeding in the name of divine right and pure lineage. Your jaw juts forward so far that your mouth cannot close, drool pools at the corners of your lips as you struggle to form words that sound human. Your swollen tongue crowds your mouth like an unwelcome intruder, turning every meal into a careful, humiliating ordeal of slow chewing and anxious swallowing. Your spine curves unnaturally, forcing your head into an awkward angle that makes you appear smaller than the throne you were born to rule. You are Charles II of Spain, the final chapter in the dark history of the Spanish Habsburgs, a tragic king whose inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born from siblings, a genetic catastrophe written into every cell of your body. It is November 1700, and though you are only 38, your limbs quake with palsy. Your skin glows pale and waxy under the flickering torchlight, and your bulging eyes, those unmistakable Habsburg eyes, stare back at you with the dull confusion that has haunted your reign. You cannot father an heir. You cannot rule your empire. You can barely cling to life. And in the darkest recesses of your failing mind, you know one unthinkable truth. Your suffering is not divine punishment, but the result of 16 generations of royal inbreeding, where cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and entire bloodlines spiraled into genetic oblivion. Before we unravel the secrets behind this royal blood curse, this chilling tale of genetic disasters and cursed royal bloodlines, hit that like button, subscribe for more dark history and history secrets, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because we're about to dive into a story where power incest and the illusion of divine right collided to create one of the most tragic kings who ever lived. For nearly 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs waged a silent war not against rival kingdoms or foreign armies, but against the very blood flowing in their veins, a war waged through royal inbreeding, driven by an obsession with divine right, royal purity, and keeping power locked tightly within family walls. It all began in 1516, when the House of Habsburg took control of Spain, forging an empire so vast it stretched from the sun-drenched plains of Castile to the icy mountains of Austria, from the wealth of the Netherlands to the gold-laden colonies of the Americas. But behind the glittering crowns and royal insignias, a far darker legacy was brewing, a genetic curse that would transform kings into prisoners of their own bodies and empires into hollow shells. The Spanish Habsburgs didn't merely marry cousins from time to time. They turned cousin marriage into a family doctrine, a twisted ritual repeated with religious devotion. Out of 11 royal marriages between 1450 and 1661, 9 were between blood relatives, uncle to niece. First cousins wedded to first cousins. And each time a royal couple stepped to the altar, the genetic trap grew tighter, weaving an invisible web of hereditary doom. The result was a lineage where children were born carrying inbreeding coefficients so extreme that modern geneticists compare them to the offspring of sibling pairs, a figure that should terrify anyone who thinks royal blood is somehow blessed. These kings wore velvet robes, but many couldn't chew food without drooling or hold court without trembling. They were born into palaces, but destined for lives overshadowed by genetic disasters, cursed royal bloodlines, and dark history secrets. And while royal propaganda painted these monarchs as chosen by God, the reality was far more chilling. Their reigns were marked by physical deformities, mental torment, and a creeping sense that the Habsburg dynasty was crumbling from within. So why did they keep marrying their own blood, even as each generation grew more broken than the last? Was it pride politics, or the terrifying illusion that their royal bloodline was worth any sacrifice? Even human suffering. Keep watching, because next we're going to peel back the velvet curtain and reveal how this tragic experiment in royal inbreeding unfolded, king by king, until it reached its nightmarish crescendo in a man who would become history's most cursed king, Charles II of Spain. Let's rewind history to where the seeds of this royal blood curse were first planted. Charles III of Spain, better known across Europe as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Born in 1500, Charles entered a world that would one day be draped in royal banners, embroidered thrones, and the illusion of invincibility. He was the master of an empire so enormous it spanned continents, from the cold winds sweeping over Austria to the sun-baked lands of Spain, from the bustling trade cities of the Netherlands to the glittering waters surrounding Italy. On the surface, Charles seemed the perfect king, intelligent, politically sharp, healthy, and destined to rule with iron authority. But look closer, and dark history secrets begin to whisper through the oil paint of his portraits. Antonio Dubitis, an Italian diplomat who laid eyes on Charles in 1517, described him with chilling precision: a long, cadaverous face and a lopsided mouth that fell open when he wasn't vigilant. It was there the earliest shadow of what the world would come to know as the Habsburg jaw, a genetic brand etched into royal flesh. Charles carried an inbreeding coefficient of 0.038, low by Habsburg standards, but already alarmingly higher than any normal bloodline. His parents were cousins, their marriage driven by royal politics, not love, sowing the first seeds of the genetic time bomb ticking within the Spanish throne. Yet the true tragedy of Charles V wasn't in his own subtle deformities, but in the choices he made for the next generation. Despite ruling an empire with access to princesses from every corner of Europe, Charles chose to marry his cousin Isabella of Portugal. Isabella's mother was Charles's aunt, his father's sister. Their union was so close that papal permission was required just to make it legal. And in that choice, Charles unknowingly loaded the genetic dice that would one day produce not just an empire, but an empire cursed from within. Because from this union would come a son named Philip II, a king whose mind and bloodline would carry the story deeper into the nightmare. And that is where our descent continues. From the union of Charles I and Isabella of Portugal emerged Philip II, a king who would inherit not just the sprawling Spanish Empire, but also the shadowy genetic legacy that would tighten its grip with every royal birth. Born in 1527, Philip arrived in the world draped in velvet and gold, the living promise of Habsburg supremacy. But hidden beneath the weight of his crown lurked the same dark history secrets that haunted his father, a face already marked with the classic Habsburg features, an elongated jaw, hooded eyes, and a mouth that seemed perpetually burdened by the effort of remaining closed. But Philip's burden went far beyond physical appearance. Modern historians believe he suffered from severe depression and possibly autism spectrum disorders, a dangerous combination in a man tasked with ruling one of history's most complex empires. His mind was a fortress of obsessions. He became fixated on religious orthodoxy, launching the Spanish Inquisition with a brutal fervor that would stain his reign forever in the chronicles of dark history. He would spend hours, sometimes entire days, rewriting a single letter, chasing what he believed was perfect wording, while the empire he ruled slipped further toward chaos. Philip II's reign was proof that royal inbreeding didn't merely warp bones and faces, it could twist the very thoughts of kings. His rigidity, born of a royal blood curse, led to disastrous wars in the Netherlands, the catastrophic failure of the Armada against England, and economic policies that pushed Spain toward bankruptcy. In his desperation to secure the royal bloodline, Philip married 4 times, including to his cousin Maria of Portugal, whose mothers were sisters, and later his niece Anna of Austria, daughter of his brother Maximilian II. This web of royal incest tightened the genetic noose around Spain's future, breeding even higher inbreeding coefficients into the next generation. And yet, for all the velvet and power, Philip's true tragedy was that while he ruled an empire that spanned oceans, his bloodline was crumbling from within. Because from his union with Anna of Austria would come a son, Philip III, a king who would carry the curse even deeper into the Habsburg nightmare. And that is where the shadows grow darker still. From the twisted branches of Philip II's royal family tree emerged Philip III, born in 1578, a monarch who would embody everything that was catastrophically wrong with the Habsburg obsession for keeping royal bloodlines pure. From the moment he entered the world, Philip III bore the unmistakable stamp of dark history secrets etched into his very flesh. Contemporary observers described him as mentally slow, physically weak, and utterly dependent on advisors to make even the most basic decisions. His inbreeding coefficient climbed so high that modern geneticists marvel he survived childhood at all, given how close his genes were to the territory of sibling offspring. And his appearance shocked even courtiers long accustomed to Habsburg peculiarities. His jaw jutted forward with such severity that he couldn't close his mouth. He drooled constantly, and his speech was so slurred by his swollen tongue and malformed jaw that conversations with the king became exercises in deciphering cryptic sounds. But perhaps the most tragic part of Philip III's existence wasn't merely his grotesque physical deformities, but the hollow vacancy behind his eyes. A monarch with the mental capacity of a child draped in silks and diamonds, yet lost in a fog of superstition and religious rituals that gave him comfort but left the empire adrift. He believed fervently in omens, spending endless hours in prayer, while actual governance fell into the hands of schemers who exploited his frailty for personal gain. Under Philip III, the Spanish Empire lurched toward ruin. Spain lost control of the Netherlands colonies in the Americas, began showing the first whispers of independence, and the royal treasury suffered multiple bankruptcies. His reign was less that of a king, and more the tragic spectacle of a royal puppet on a stage haunted by the shadows of a genetic curse. And through it all, he carried forward the fatal mission of preserving the royal bloodline, marrying Margaret of Austria, yet another cousin, further twisting the genetic spiral downward. Because from their union would come Philip IV, a king whose reign would be longer, darker, and even more haunted by the monstrous echoes of royal inbreeding. And that is where our journey plunges deeper into this royal blood curse. From the shadows of Philip III's frail reign stepped Philip IV, born in 1605, a monarch destined to rule for an astonishing 44 years, one of the longest reigns in Spanish history. But if length of reign equaled greatness, Spain might have flourished. Instead, under Philip IV, the royal blood curse of the Habsburgs grew darker, deeper, and more merciless. Portraits by Diego Velázquez capture him perfectly: the elongated skull, the jutting Habsburg jaw, the hooded eyes staring blankly into a void only he seemed to see. His auburn hair framed a face described by his courtiers as melancholy, distant, and burdened by secrets no crown could protect him from. And behind those haunted eyes raged an inner storm. Philip IV suffered from severe depression, a darkness so profound that modern psychiatrists would likely diagnose him with major depressive disorder, perhaps with psychotic features. He would disappear into his chambers for weeks, refusing visitors, refusing state business, talking to paintings as if they were living people, convinced at times that his own courtiers plotted his demise. His empire, meanwhile, bled from 1,000 wounds. Under Philip IV, Spain slid further from its golden age into the abyss of wars it could not win and debts it could not pay. Yet the king's mind remained obsessed with a single goal: producing a male heir to carry on the royal bloodline despite the genetic doom etched into every Habsburg gene. His first wife, Isabella of Bourbon, a cousin, naturally gave him several children, but all except one daughter, Maria Theresa, died young. When Isabella died in 1644, Philip's desperation grew. Following the twisted tradition of royal inbreeding, he married his niece Mariana of Austria, his own brother's daughter, a union so close it stands among the most extreme in Habsburg history. Their children would become the last fragile hope of a dynasty teetering on the brink of collapse, most dying young. Except for one son born in 1661, a child destined to become Charles II, the king whose existence would transform a secret genetic curse into the most visible royal tragedy Europe had ever witnessed. And it's there, in the fragile cradle of a newborn prince, that the nightmare of royal inbreeding reaches its horrifying crescendo. And so from the desperate union of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria was born Charles II of Spain, a child who would become not just the king of an empire, but the ultimate living proof of how royal inbreeding could transform bloodlines into biological nightmares. Born on November 6, 1661, Charles entered the world already carrying the crushing weight of 16 generations of cousin marriages, uncle-niece pairings, and genetic entanglements so dense that modern scientists calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0, 254 higher than that typically seen in the children of siblings. From the moment of his birth, Charles was different. French court records described him as a baby with herpes-like rashes, a scalp covered in scabs, and a channel of pus oozing from his right ear, a chilling beginning for a boy destined to wear a crown. Rumors swirled that even his sexual organs were so malformed that courtiers struggled to determine his gender in infancy. As he grew, the physical horrors multiplied. He never learned to walk properly. His legs were weak and twisted. His spine curved into unnatural shapes. His balance was so poor that he required constant support just to stand. He didn't utter his first words until age 4, and even then his speech was so slurred by his enormous tongue and grotesquely protruding jaw that only a handful of attendants could decipher his meaning. The infamous Habsburg jaw reached its grotesque climax in Charles II, his lower mandible jutting so far forward that he could not close his mouth or chew solid food, transforming every meal into an ordeal of drooling, choking, and humiliation. Court physicians wrote that watching him eat was an agony in itself as food fell from his lips, and he struggled for minutes to swallow what others consumed in seconds. Mentally, he remained trapped in a childlike fog, unable to read, write, or comprehend the complexities of kingship, earning him the chilling nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Despite his frailty, Charles II was twice married, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans, who recoiled from his presence, and then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but both unions remained childless, sealing the doom of the Spanish Habsburg line. His death on November 1, 1700, just days shy of his 39th birthday, marked the collapse of a dynasty and the final chapter of the most extreme royal blood curse in European history. But royal inbreeding didn't end with Charles II, because as Europe plunged into the War of Spanish Succession, other royal houses like those of ancient Egypt had already written dark chapters of their own genetic tragedies. And that is where our story turns next as we journey back thousands of years to the temples and tombs of the pharaohs. Long before the Spanish Habsburgs twisted their bloodlines into a genetic nightmare, another royal dynasty had already perfected the art of marrying within their own sacred circle, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. For over 3,000 years, Egypt's royal families practiced sibling marriage not merely as political convenience, but as a religious duty, a divine strategy to keep the blood of the gods undiluted by mortal veins. In the gleaming halls of limestone temples and under the watchful eyes of towering statues, pharaohs and queens repeated the same vow to marry their sisters, their brothers, and even their own children, because to do otherwise was to threaten the very cosmic order, or Ma'at, that held the universe together. The royal blood curse wasn't merely an accident in Egypt. It was state policy, a chilling, dark history secret etched into hieroglyphs and papyrus scrolls, reminding us that absolute power can drive even the most glorious civilizations into the grip of genetic oblivion. The logic was brutally simple. If the pharaoh was the living god Horus on earth, how could he share his divine seed with anyone who wasn't of royal blood? And so generation after generation, the royal gene pool became an echo chamber repeating the same strands of DNA until deformities, genetic disasters, and tragic kings became as much a part of the royal court as the golden headdresses and the scent of sacred incense. From the sands of Karnak to the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the signs are everywhere: elongated skulls carved into stone reliefs, statues of pharaohs with impossibly slender limbs, and inscriptions praising queens who were also sisters and mothers in the same breath. But while the gods demanded purity, the human body demanded genetic diversity, a war that would ultimately destroy dynasties and leave behind stories so astonishing they still echo through history secrets and royal blood curse documentaries today. And nowhere does this genetics saga reach more haunting heights than in the life of one extraordinary and extraordinarily tragic Pharaoh Akhenaten, because in him the divine and the deformed collided in a way that changed Egypt forever. And that is where our story turns next. Among the endless stone faces of ancient Egypt none stands out more strangely or more tragically than Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king who ruled during the 18th dynasty, around 1353 to 1336 BCE. Akhenaten is a name that pulses through dark history secrets and royal blood curse discussions because he wasn't just a pharaoh who dared to challenge Egypt's mighty pantheon. He was a living embodiment of the genetic consequences of centuries of royal inbreeding. His reign is infamous for a religious revolution that shattered traditions as he abandoned the countless gods of Egypt and forced his people to worship only Aten, the sun disk. But look past the theological upheaval, and you find an even more chilling story carved into the very bones of Akhenaten's body. Surviving statues and relief carvings show a man whose features are disturbingly alien, a face so elongated it appears almost serpentine, a pointed chin, sunken cheeks, a neck stretched longer than nature intended, and a skull shaped like an otherworldly crown. His body defied masculine norms with slender limbs and a torso marked by rounded hips, pronounced breasts, and a swollen belly that gave him an eerie, almost pregnant silhouette. Modern medical experts have pored over these images and proposed diagnoses that read like chapters in a genetic horror tale: aromatase excess syndrome, causing his body to flood with female hormones, and craniosynostosis, fusing his skull bones prematurely into an unnatural shape. And all of this flowed directly from the royal blood curse, the centuries of pharaohs marrying sisters and daughters, closing their family tree tighter and tighter, until even a living god was born, twisted by mortal genes. Akhenaten wasn't merely a religious zealot. He may have been driven to spiritual extremism by the genetic torment within his own flesh. Yet the darkness didn't stop with him. Because in keeping with the royal traditions of incestuous devotion, Akhenaten married not only his sister Nefertiti, but even his daughters Meritaten and Ankhesenamun unions that would produce children so genetically fragile few survived into adulthood. But the genetic tragedy of Egypt would reach its heartbreaking peak in the life of one young pharaoh whose tomb would become the most famous archaeological discovery in history, Tutankhamun. And that is where our shadows now fall next. In the dusty corridors of Egypt's Valley of the Kings lies a name that has haunted historians, archaeologists, and lovers of dark history secrets for over a century: Tutankhamun, known to the world as the Boy King. Tutankhamun ruled Egypt from approximately 1332 to 1323 BCE, but the true story buried beneath his golden mask is far more harrowing than any treasure uncovered in his tomb. His life was a living testament to the royal blood curse, a child born from the union of Akhenaten and one of Akhenaten's sisters, a brother-sister marriage that sealed his genetic fate before he ever drew breath. Tutankhamun entered the world carrying the silent marks of royal inbreeding, his body a battlefield of genetic disasters. Modern CT scans of his mummified remains reveal a young man who suffered from a severe clubfoot so painful he required 130 walking sticks. These weren't ceremonial symbols of pharaonic power, but practical tools just to help him move from room to room. His spine curved unnaturally, bending his posture into a stoop, unbefitting a living god, while his elongated skull mirrored the same disturbing features seen in his father Akhenaten. Worse still, Tutankhamun bore a cleft palate that likely affected his speech, a vulnerability that must have made his whispered royal commands sound more like the trembling voice of a sick child than the decree of a divine ruler. Genetic studies have uncovered even more tragic truths. He suffered from multiple genetic disorders that ravaged his immune system, making him particularly vulnerable to infections that a healthy body might have resisted. DNA evidence even found traces of malaria parasites in his bones, the earliest confirmed case of the disease in human history. But perhaps the darkest chapter in his story lies in the children he tried to produce. Tutankhamun married his half-sister Ankhesenamun in a desperate attempt to preserve the royal bloodline. But their two daughters were stillborn, their tiny mummified bodies interred alongside their father, further evidence that the genetic curse had tightened its grip to the point of extinguishing an entire dynasty. Yet royal incest wasn't unique to Egypt. Across the centuries, other rulers would walk the same doomed path, none more systematically than the Greek pharaohs who would one day rule Egypt under the Ptolemaic dynasty. And that is the next dark veil we must lift. As if Egypt's ancient pharaohs hadn't already carved enough tragedy into the stone walls of history, another royal dynasty arrived to carry the torch of genetic doom even further, the Ptolemaic dynasty. When Alexander the Great swept into Egypt in 332 BCE, he planted Greek rulers upon the pharaonic throne, birthing a new royal bloodline that would fuse Greek ambition with Egyptian divinity and take royal inbreeding to heights that shocked even the ancient world. The Ptolemies didn't merely dabble in incest, they perfected it, transforming sibling marriage into an unshakable system, a dark tradition repeated generation after generation in the name of political power and dynastic purity. This wasn't just marriage for love or royal convenience, it was a calculated strategy designed to lock power within the royal house, ensuring that no outsider could ever stake a claim to Egypt's unimaginable wealth or its aura of divine authority. The Ptolemaic marriage system became one of the most extreme chapters in dark history secrets and the chronicles of cursed royal bloodlines. It began with Ptolemy II and his sister wife Arsinoe II, but from that union sprang a precedent so powerful that it chained the entire dynasty into an ever-tightening circle of incest. Brothers married sisters as a matter of royal duty, and the offspring of those unions grew up to marry their own siblings, in turn turning the Ptolemaic family tree into a twisted spiral of shared DNA that left little room for genetic escape. And as the centuries passed, the royal blood curse began to manifest. Visibly, rulers grew increasingly obese, their necks swollen into thick masses suggesting goiters, and their eyes bulged grotesquely from their sockets. A physical transformation documented not just in crumbling mummies, but on coins that bore their likeness for all of Egypt to see. But while many Ptolemies would suffer under the weight of this genetic burden, one ruler in particular would come to personify the grotesque consequences of centuries of royal incest, Ptolemy VIII, the bloated king whose very nickname became synonymous with excess and deformity. And that is the face we're about to meet next. Among the long, twisted line of the Ptolemaic dynasty, no ruler better embodied the grotesque consequences of royal inbreeding than Ptolemy VIII, a king whose body and reign became living monuments to excess deformity and the dark history secrets of cursed royal bloodlines. Born into a family tree that was less a branching oak and more a tightly wound spiral of sibling marriages, Ptolemy VIII carried the genetic legacy of generations of incestuous unions, and it showed in every inch of his bloated frame. He ruled Egypt in two tumultuous stretches from 170 to 163 BCE, and then again from 145 to 116 BCE, earning the unforgettable nickname Physcon, meaning fatty, a name that became both an insult and a grim descriptor of the royal blood curse that had transformed him. Contemporary accounts paint a chilling portrait. Ptolemy VIII was grotesquely obese. His belly distended to such extremes that he could barely walk, without assistance, a spectacle that left courtiers and foreign envoys both horrified and fascinated. His neck bulged with what modern doctors would likely identify as a goiter, and his eyes protruded unnaturally from his face, classic signs of thyroid disease possibly linked to the tight web of genetic disorders that haunted the Ptolemaic line. But Ptolemy's problems went far deeper than physical deformity. His mental state was as volatile as his body was swollen. He was infamous for bouts of paranoia, cruelty, and explosive rage, ordering mass executions of Alexandrian intellectuals, purging rivals, and engaging in vicious feuds with his own family members that shattered the royal court. He married not just his sister Cleopatra II, but also took his niece Cleopatra III as a second wife, entangling the dynasty in yet another layer of genetic catastrophe. These overlapping relationships produced children whose genetic inheritance was so dangerously concentrated that many died young or suffered visible developmental issues. But the true face of the Ptolemaic blood curse, the woman who would become an icon of both seduction and genetic exhaustion, was yet to come. Her name was Cleopatra VII, and she would be the last flickering ember of a dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own blood. And that is the tragic figure we must confront next. And so we arrive at the final, dazzling yet tragic figure of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra VII, a queen whose name still echoes through the corridors of history, wrapped in tales of seduction, political intrigue, and fatal romance. But behind the shimmering legend lies a darker truth. Cleopatra was the living culmination of at least 8 generations of royal inbreeding, the ultimate product of a dynasty whose obsession with pure bloodlines became its undoing. Despite Hollywood's gilded fantasies casting her as a slender goddess with flawless features, real coins and sculptures tell a starkly different story. Cleopatra VII bore the physical marks of the royal blood curse: a hooked nose, a round, fuller face, and a sturdy, even heavy-build features hinting at the same metabolic disorders that haunted so many of her ancestors, likely rooted in genetic disasters perpetuated by centuries of sibling marriages. Her parents were brother and sister, as were her grandparents, and the family tree behind her twisted back upon itself so many times that her genetic heritage was an echo chamber of repeating DNA. And though Cleopatra wielded intelligence and charisma powerful enough to sway the most influential men of Rome, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, her personal life remained chained to the ancient royal practice of incest. She was forced to marry her younger brothers, first Ptolemy III and later Ptolemy XIV, in unions designed to keep power locked safely within the Ptolemaic bloodline. Yet even Cleopatra recognized the doom tightening around her dynasty. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were more than mere love affairs. They were desperate gambles to inject new blood into a lineage gasping for genetic survival. But destiny would not be denied. When Cleopatra died in 30 BCE by snakebite, or perhaps by poison, she took with her the last pure strain of the Ptolemaic dynasty's royal blood, a bloodline that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, only to collapse under the weight of its own genetic obsession. Yet the lessons of royal inbreeding didn't die with Cleopatra. Across empires and ages, the curse of keeping blood pure would continue to haunt royal courts, prompting questions that modern science would finally begin to answer. And that is where we must turn our eyes next, to the cold clarity of genetic truth. So how could entire royal bloodlines, ruling empires, commanding armies, and shaping the fate of millions, fall victim to such horrific genetic tragedies? The answer lies not in curses cast by vengeful gods, but in the cold clinical world of genetics, a realm of secrets even darker than the shadows of royal palaces. When closely related individuals have children, those children are far more likely to inherit 2 identical copies of harmful recessive genes, triggering genetic disasters that can twist bones, warp faces, and shatter minds. In a healthy, genetically diverse population, those harmful recessive genes are often masked by normal copies inherited from unrelated parents, lying dormant, invisible, harmless. But in royal families where cousins marry cousins, uncles marry nieces, and siblings marry siblings across multiple generations, those recessive genes begin to overlap, compound, and transform bloodlines into ticking time bombs. Take Charles II of Spain as the ultimate example. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree revealed that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. To put that into chilling perspective, the child of 2 first cousins would typically have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.0625. The child of siblings would be 0.25. Charles II's genetic makeup was the equivalent of being born to siblings, except with additional damage piled on from 16 generations of repeated cousin marriages. That's why his jaw protruded so grotesquely that he couldn't close his mouth, why his tongue clogged his speech, why his body failed to produce an heir, and why his mind remained trapped in the shadows of confusion. And the horrors didn't stop with physical deformities. Inbreeding depression reaches far deeper, attacking the immune system, the brain, and the very capacity for survival. Across royal bloodlines, from the Habsburgs to the Pharaohs, this genetic plague manifested in epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, anxiety disorders, depression, and catastrophic immune deficiencies. The royal blood curse wasn't a fairy tale. It was the predictable outcome of human choices made over centuries by people obsessed with power purity and dynastic survival. Court physicians documented these horrors in painstaking detail, yet the marriages continued, driven by fear, ambition, and the relentless logic of political alliances. But if there's one truth that history whispers through these dark corridors, it's that even the mightiest crowns cannot escape the laws written into our DNA. And while the science finally helps us understand these tragedies, there remains a far more human question. What did it feel like to live inside those broken bodies, staring into mirrors that reflected monstrous fates? And that is the shadow we step into as we reach our final reflection. We return now to that cold mirror, to the cruel glass that reflected not only Charles II's twisted jaw and haunted eyes, but the silent agony of every king, every pharaoh, every ruler, trapped by the invisible chains of the royal blood curse. When you look into that mirror, you don't just see Charles II gasping for breath, or Tutankhamun leaning on his walking sticks, or Philip IV staring into endless shadows of depression. You see the faces of men who were born into unimaginable privilege, yet condemned to suffer as prisoners inside bodies and minds, twisted by centuries of royal inbreeding, a genetic legacy passed down like a deadly crown. These rulers weren't monsters, freaks, or bizarre curiosities for the pages of dark history secrets. They were human beings who deserved lives free from pain, humiliation, and the horror of being reduced to nothing more than pawns in dynastic chess games. Their suffering wasn't divine punishment or the vengeance of angry gods. It was the predictable result of human ambition, a price paid for political power, and the ruthless belief that royal blood must remain pure at all costs. In their pain, we find more than tragedy. We find warnings written in flesh and bone about the dangers of treating people as tools to secure thrones, alliances, or bloodlines. We're reminded that the true nobility of a ruler or any human being lies not in the so-called purity of their blood, but in the courage to see our shared humanity. The royal blood curse has been broken, but its echoes remain a timeless caution for anyone tempted to believe that power and purity are worth the sacrifice of human dignity. And perhaps the greatest lesson these kings and pharaohs leave behind is that, even in the darkest corners of human history, the human spirit endures. The mirror doesn't lie even when we wish it would. But in the reflections of these tragic kings and queens, we see not just the horrors of royal inbreeding, but also the spark of resilience that refused to be entirely snuffed out. And if you found these dark history secrets as chilling and fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more royal blood curse stories and genetic disasters from history, and tell me in the comments which dynasty you'd like to explore next. Because there's always another shadow waiting in the corridors of history. And that is a story we'll uncover together. So when you next gaze into your own mirror, remember this: your worth is not defined by the blood in your veins, nor by the lineage behind your name, but by the choices you make to honor your humanity. The tragic kings and queens we've met tonight remind us that even under crowns, people suffer when trapped by the chains of tradition and fear. Let's learn from their pain and refuse to sacrifice compassion for power. If these dark history secrets made you think differently about the price of pure blood, smash that like button, save this video for later chills, and subscribe for more royal blood curse stories. Drop a comment below and tell me which royal dynasty should we expose next. Let's uncover history's shadows together.